Marcus Johnson had lived in his quiet suburban neighborhood for almost a decade. He worked hard as a civil engineer, loved tending to his garden on weekends, and valued peace above all else. His home was his sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after long days in the city. That peace, however, began to crack the moment Karen Whitmore moved into the house across the street. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the president of the local HOA, a title she wielded like a sword. At first, her annoyances were small: condescending remarks about his lawn, unsolicited notes about proper neighborhood decorum, and passive-aggressive stares if he parked his truck in front of his own house. Marcus brushed it off, chalking it up to the usual HOA politics. But things took a strange turn one Thursday morning. When Marcus left for work, he noticed a shiny white Lexus parked in his driveway. Confused, he looked around for any signs of visitors, but his wife was already at work and his teenage daughter was at school. He sighed, assuming it was an innocent mistake, maybe a delivery driver who had stepped away. But when he returned that evening, the Lexus was still there. Irritated, Marcus rang Karen's doorbell. She opened the door with a smug half-smile, holding a wine glass like she was in the middle of a spa day. "Oh, that's mine," she said, casually, not moving an inch. "Hope you don't mind. My driveway's getting pressure washed today." Marcus blinked. "You could have asked. That's not really. Oh, it's just for the day." Karen interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "It's not like you needed it while you were gone." Marcus bit his tongue. He didn't like confrontation, especially over something that could be resolved peacefully. "Fine," he muttered, "but next time ask first." The problem was, there was a next time, and a next, and a next. Soon, every other week, Marcus would come home to find Karen's Lexus, or sometimes her son's sports car, sitting in his driveway without so much as a text or note. At first, he knocked on her door each time, but she always had an excuse: construction on her driveway, visitors, emergency. And somehow, in her mind, that justified taking over his private property. The final straw came one Saturday morning when Marcus was about to leave for a fishing trip he'd been planning for weeks. He walked outside at 5 a.m., tackle box in hand, only to see Karen's Lexus blocking him in. She had parked so far back into his driveway that he couldn't even maneuver around it. He knocked on her door, no answer. He called her voicemail. That was when Marcus realized this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Karen wasn't just parking in his driveway for convenience. She was doing it because she thought she could get away with it. And Marcus? Well, he was done being the quiet, agreeable neighbor. He went back inside, set down his fishing gear, and began searching for the phone number he needed. If Karen thought she could use his driveway like her own personal parking space, she was in for a surprise, and Marcus was ready to make sure it would be a permanent lesson. The first time it happened, Marcus had given Karen the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she'd been in a rush, maybe her garage was being used for something else, maybe she simply didn't realize she'd parked in the wrong driveway. But after the fourth time in a single week, it was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a choice. Marcus had just returned from a late shift at the hospital when he found her shiny white SUV sitting in his driveway again, blocking the garage, so he couldn't pull his own car in. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, debating whether to knock on her door or just call the police. The HOA rules were crystal clear. No resident had the right to block another's driveway. But Karen had always acted like she was above those rules. This time, Marcus decided he wasn't going to let it slide. He marched up to her door and rang the bell, his patience worn thin. She opened it after a long pause, still in her yoga pants and holding a glass of wine. "Oh, Marcus, you're home late," she said casually, as if she hadn't completely inconvenienced him. "I had friends over and needed more parking space. You don't really use your driveway that much, do you?" Marcus took a deep breath. "Karen, this is the fourth time this week. You can't keep blocking my driveway. It's against the HOA rules, and it's my property. You need to move your car now." She smirked, leaning on the doorframe. "Relax, it's just a driveway. You don't have to get so territorial. Besides, the HOA likes me. You're not really going to make a fuss over something so small, are you?" Her tone dripped with arrogance, as if she were daring him to challenge her. Marcus clenched his jaw. He could see the smug confidence in her eyes, the same look she always wore during HOA meetings when she bullied other neighbors into getting her way. She was counting on him to just roll over and let it go. But this time, Marcus wasn't in the mood to play along. "I'm asking you one last time, Karen. Move your car, or I'll have it towed." She laughed, actually laughed, as if the idea was absurd. "You wouldn't dare. The tow companies around here know me. I've been here longer than you, Marcus. You're new. You should try being friendlier instead of starting trouble." That was it. The casual disrespect, the entitlement, the assumption that she could do whatever she wanted because of her status in the neighborhood. Marcus was done. He turned on his heel without another word, pulled out his phone, and called the tow company. 20 minutes later, the sound of a truck's hydraulic lift echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac. Karen came running outside in her slippers, shouting and waving her hands as her SUV was hoisted into the air. The tow truck driver ignored her protests. Marcus had all the legal proof he needed to authorize the tow. Karen glared at him across the driveway. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. But Marcus just smiled faintly. "No, Karen, you are." What Karen didn't know was that this was just the beginning, because Marcus had a plan to make sure she never parked in his driveway again. By the third month of Karen's relentless intrusion, David's patience had stretched thinner than a thread about to snap. Every morning, he would open his curtains and see her shiny, smug-looking SUV sitting proudly in the middle of his driveway like it was her personal parking spot. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating. He had tried polite reminders, sent HOA complaint forms, and even left a bright orange "No parking" sign taped to the curb. Every single attempt had been met with Karen's dismissive smirk and the same patronizing excuse. "Oh, I'll just be a few minutes, sweetie." But a few minutes always turned into hours. Sometimes she left it there overnight, forcing David to park on the street like a guest in front of his own house. The final straw came on a Saturday morning when David had an important community charity event to attend. He'd been asked to speak, and arriving on time mattered to him. But when he walked outside, coffee in hand, he was greeted once again by that all-too-familiar sight, Karen's SUV blocking his driveway. His stomach tightened. He checked the time. He had less than 30 minutes to get across town. He called her phone, straight to voicemail. He knocked on her door, no answer. It was obvious she wasn't home, or worse, she was deliberately ignoring him. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was pure arrogance. In that moment, David decided enough was enough. No more polite requests. No more hoping the HOA would step in. He pulled out his phone and called the tow company directly. The dispatcher didn't need much convincing. Apparently, David wasn't the first neighbor to complain about Karen's antics. Within 20 minutes, a tow truck was backing into the driveway, the driver whistling as he hooked the SUV to his rig. David stood with his arms crossed, watching as the massive vehicle lifted Karen's prized possession into the air. When the driver drove off, David felt a small wave of satisfaction wash over him. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Karen was not the type to let something like this go quietly. He braced himself for the storm that was sure to come. And sure enough, later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, his doorbell rang hard and fast. When he opened it, Karen stood there, red-faced and trembling with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she screeched. David met her glare with calm, steady eyes. "Yes," he replied. "I made sure you won't park in my driveway again." She sputtered, unable to form a comeback, before storming off in a huff. But as David closed his door, he had the uneasy feeling that this war was far from over. And he was right. Karen was just getting started. The morning started like any other for Darnell. He was sipping his coffee, scrolling through emails, and enjoying the rare peace of a Saturday morning when the now familiar sight out his front window made his blood pressure spike. Karen's shiny white SUV was once again squatting in his driveway like it owned the place. She had left it so close to his garage door that Darnell couldn't even pull his own car out without risking a scrape. He clenched his jaw, the warmth of his coffee doing nothing to soothe his growing irritation. This had gone on for weeks, months, really, despite the numerous polite conversations, warning notes, and even a certified letter he'd sent her. Each time, Karen either pretended she didn't see the issue or flat out told him, "It's just a driveway, relax." But today, something in him shifted. He'd had enough. Darnell picked up his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and dialed the number of a local towing company he had researched the night before. "Yeah, I've got an unauthorized vehicle blocking my property," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Yes, I want it removed immediately." The dispatcher asked for details, and within 15 minutes, the low rumble of a tow truck pulling up broke the morning quiet. Darnell stood on his porch, coffee in hand, as the driver, a burly man in oil-stained coveralls, walked up. "That the one?" the man asked, jerking his thumb toward the SUV. "That's the one," Darnell replied without hesitation. The driver got to work with methodical precision, securing the SUV to the truck's lift. As the hydraulic arm groaned, raising Karen's vehicle off the ground, Darnell felt an unfamiliar sense of justice. The sight was oddly satisfying. Just as the tow truck began to pull away, Karen came storming down the street, her face red and twisted in disbelief. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, waving her arms wildly. The tow driver barely looked at her, focused on his task. Darnell took a slow sip of his coffee and said evenly, "Removing an illegally parked vehicle from my property, you've been warned, Karen." Her outrage was almost theatrical. She sputtered about HOA rules, neighborhood friendliness, and how he was making a big deal over nothing. But the tow truck was already heading down the street, her car in tow, leaving her standing in the middle of the road in her bathrobe, fuming like a kettle on the verge of boiling over. Darnell didn't bother engaging further. Instead, he walked back into his house, closed the door, and finally, felt like he had taken control of the situation. What he didn't know was that this single act would ignite a neighborhood drama unlike anything he had experienced before. And Karen? She wasn't about to let this go without a fight. After the first tow, Darnell thought the ordeal might finally be over. Surely, Karen would think twice before parking in his driveway again, especially after the embarrassment of watching her car get hauled away in front of the whole neighborhood. But Karen was nothing if not stubborn and audacious. Just 3 days later, as Darnell returned from work, he was greeted by the unmistakable sight of her Lexus once again, proudly occupying his driveway like a crown jewel. This time, there was no apology note, no excuse, no attempt to pretend it was temporary. It was a deliberate act of defiance. Darnell sighed deeply, the frustration bubbling up inside him. He had hoped for civility, for a neighborly resolution. But Karen had made it clear she intended to test his limits, to assert her so-called HOA power through blatant disrespect. He called the tow company again, but this time, something told him the fight was bigger than a simple parking dispute. The very next morning, a group of Karen's HOA allies gathered at a neighborhood coffee shop, murmuring about Darnell's outrageous actions and how he was stirring trouble. Flyers appeared on windshields, warning residents to beware of property disputes and praising Karen as a victim of harassment. Social media posts painted Darnell as the aggressor, accusing him of bullying an elderly neighbor. But none of these accusations touched the truth. Karen was the one repeatedly invading private property, flaunting the rules, and disregarding common courtesy. Meanwhile, Darnell doubled down. He attended the next HOA meeting with a folder bursting with photos, timestamps, tow receipts, and even testimonies from other neighbors who had witnessed Karen's behavior. When it was his turn to speak, he laid out the facts calmly and clearly, refusing to let emotion cloud his message. "This isn't about petty parking," he said. "It's about respecting property rights and living peacefully as neighbors. If we allow this kind of entitlement to continue, it undermines everything the HOA stands for." Karen, clearly rattled by the mounting evidence and growing neighborhood support for Darnell, tried to turn the tables. She accused him of harassment, demanded new parking policies favoring long-term residents, and suggested fines be levied against anyone who reported her. But the board, caught between loyalty and fairness, hesitated. It was clear the situation was spiraling out of control. Behind the scenes, Karen ramped up her tactics. She started parking in other neighbors' driveways, sending passive-aggressive letters, and even called city code enforcement to complain about Darnell's landscaping, a move seen by many as petty retaliation. Darnell ignored the distractions and kept documenting everything. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore, it was about standing up to an abuse of power and entitlement. As tensions reached a boiling point, word spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets caught wind of the story, a David versus Goliath battle between a hardworking homeowner and a notoriously difficult HOA president. Suddenly, Darnell's quiet suburban dispute was a symbol of larger issues: fairness, respect, and the fight against unchecked privilege. The chapter closed with Darnell standing on his porch late at night, looking out over the quiet street. He knew Karen wouldn't stop until she'd pushed every boundary possible, but he was ready. This was no longer a simple parking disagreement. It was a fight for dignity, justice, and the right to call his house a home. The next HOA meeting was the most anticipated event in the neighborhood's recent history. For weeks, the tension between Karen and Darnell had simmered beneath polite conversations and polite smiles, but now it was about to boil over in front of the entire community. The small, stuffy clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. Neighbors who had previously avoided HOA meetings showed up, curious to witness the confrontation that had everyone talking. Chairs creaked under the weight of anxious bodies, whispered speculations, and the occasional nervous laugh. The air was thick with anticipation as the HOA president called the meeting to order. Karen was already there, sitting at the front like a queen on her throne. Her posture was rigid, her eyes sharp and scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge her. She wore her usual crisp blazer, a subtle reminder of her self-appointed authority. Darnell arrived shortly after, carrying his now famous folder filled with evidence, the photos of her cars in his driveway, tow receipts, the timestamps, and even notes from other neighbors who had witnessed Karen's pattern of entitlement. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she launched into a rehearsed tirade about how she was the victim of harassment and defamation by Darnell, painting herself as a long-time, respected resident who was being unfairly targeted. She accused him of disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood and warned that if he continued, she would take legal action. Some neighbors nodded in sympathy, others shifted uncomfortably, unsure which side to support. Then Darnell stood up. His voice was steady and calm, yet carried the undeniable weight of truth. He laid out the entire saga without hyperbole or anger, simply recounting facts, times, dates, repeated violations, and the impact on his life and peace of mind. He even read aloud the passive-aggressive note Karen left on his car, a chilling reminder of her attitude. The room grew silent as the reality of the situation sank in. Several neighbors who had been quietly watching spoke up in support of Darnell, confirming they had witnessed Karen parking in other people's driveways and other questionable HOA tactics. The tide was turning. The HOA board, faced with mounting evidence and a growing community consensus, finally broke their silence. The president cleared his throat and addressed Karen directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, the board has reviewed the evidence and the concerns raised. It is clear that parking in private driveways without permission violates our community guidelines and local ordinances." Karen's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth to argue, but found no support from the board or the crowd. The president continued, "Effective immediately, you are directed to cease all unauthorized parking on private property, including Mr. Johnson's driveway. Any further violations will result in fines and potential legal action." The room erupted in a mix of murmurs and applause. Karen sat back, defeated but refusing to show it openly. Darnell allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He knew this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statement to the entire neighborhood about accountability and respect. That night, as the meeting dispersed, Karen's friends avoided eye contact with her. She had lost not just the argument, but the unofficial crown she'd worn for so long. Meanwhile, Darnell received quiet congratulations from neighbors who finally felt empowered to stand up to the bullying that had plagued their community for years. Though the battle was far from over, Karen was known for her stubbornness and tenacity. This showdown marked a turning point. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood was reclaiming its sense of fairness and community, and Darnell, once just a quiet homeowner, had become the unlikely hero who refused to back down. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with an air thick with anticipation and simmering tension. Marcus had never seen the usually dull neighborhood clubhouse so packed. Every chair was taken, with several neighbors standing along the walls or squeezed into the doorway. Whispers filled the room as residents speculated about what was sure to be the most explosive meeting in recent memory. After months of Karen's relentless parking in Marcus's driveway and the ensuing conflict, everyone wanted to see how it would finally unfold. The HOA president, a man who had often sided with Karen in the past, called the meeting to order with a sharp bang of his gavel, trying to restore order. Karen sat confidently near the front, her posture rigid, eyes scanning the crowd with a look of superiority that had infuriated Marcus from the start. She was dressed immaculately, as if preparing for a battle she expected to win. Marcus arrived a little late, carrying a thick folder containing all the evidence he had collected over the months. Photos time-stamped with Karen's car blocking his driveway, tow receipts, copies of his complaints to the HOA, and notes from other neighbors who had witnessed Karen's blatant disregard for the rules. When the floor opened for discussion, Karen seized the moment with practiced ease. She launched into a tirade filled with accusations, portraying herself as the victim of harassment by Marcus, painting him as an aggressive newcomer trying to unsettle the peaceful neighborhood. She emphasized her long tenure as a resident and hinted at her connections within the HOA board, suggesting that Marcus was overstepping his bounds. Her voice was sharp, dripping with condescension as she demanded new parking rules to protect long-term residents like herself, insisting that the HOA needed to update their policies to prevent neighbors from making baseless complaints. The room was divided. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, remembering Karen's past involvement in the community, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Then Marcus stood up. The room quieted instantly, the weight of his presence palpable. He spoke calmly but firmly, his voice carrying clear and steady through the room. Without hyperbole or anger, he laid out the facts: the repeated unauthorized parking, the documented evidence of times and dates, the expenses incurred from towing, and the disruption to his daily life. He even read aloud the mocking note Karen had left on his car, an insult that underscored her blatant disrespect. Marcus's words cut through the tension like a blade, stripping away Karen's defenses. Several neighbors then stood up, adding their voices in support. Some shared their own stories of Karen's entitlement, confirming that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior that had affected multiple residents. The atmosphere shifted as murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Faced with overwhelming evidence and growing community support for Marcus, the HOA president cleared his throat and addressed Karen directly. Mrs. Whitmore, the board has thoroughly reviewed the evidence presented today. It is clear that parking in private driveways without permission is a violation of both HOA regulations and local ordinances. Karen's face flushed, her composure faltering for the first time that evening. The statement was firm and unequivocal. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but found no allies willing to back her up. The room buzzed with quiet applause and nods of approval as she sank back into her seat, defeated but clearly unwilling to admit it openly. Marcus allowed himself a small, victorious smile. He knew this wasn't just a personal win, it was a turning point for the entire neighborhood. For years, Karen had wielded her HOA position like a weapon, intimidating neighbors and bending rules to suit her whims. Now the tide was turning. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus was approached by several neighbors who thanked him quietly for standing up to the bully who had made their lives difficult for so long. Karen, meanwhile, slipped out quickly, avoiding eye contact and the cold stares from those who had once been her supporters. The chapter closed on a hopeful note. The neighborhood was reclaiming its sense of fairness and respect, and Marcus had become a symbol of courage and resilience. Though Karen's stubbornness meant the conflict was not entirely over, this HOA showdown had marked a decisive victory.